Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 26th of November 2024. This is a geopolitical video and I have an awful lot of tabs to get through, three groups of lots of tabs, so I better get on with it. We're going to start with NATO. NATO Parliamentary Assembly calls for Ukraine's accession, quote, as soon as possible. Wow. Delegates from NATO member states and legislatures voiced their support for Ukraine becoming the 33rd member of the alliance in a resolution adopted by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly yesterday. That is a really big call, and interesting that I don't know if that's unanimously so, and whether it'd be interesting to see what Hungary and Turkey had to say about that, and Slovakia. Nevertheless, I think that's really encouraging news. They've also called for a strategic approach to counter Russia's threat and urge sustained increased support for Ukraine. That is definitely positive. Resolutions include advanced weapon deliveries, air defences, and recognising Ukraine's right to strike military targets in Russia. So I've been talking about this a lot recently. This morning included how the US appears to be wanting to take a step back with regard to support for Ukraine. I think it's going to be very difficult to see the US giving further appropriations bills and packages to Ukraine of military aid to Ukraine. That seems to be unlikely, although there are these different approaches to the peace plan that they have in mind, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But everyone else has to step up if that is the case. That is NATO, without the US at the helm of NATO, really. And that is the EU, that is Europe as a whole. So that includes Norway and UK. And interestingly, Norway's just come out. So if you remember, last week we reported that the right-wing opposition party in Norway was saying, hey, we've made so much money out of the war, as in our national sovereign wealth fund has increased in value so much because the price of oil has gone up so much, and we're drilling a lot of oil in the North Sea. We have a huge amount of money. We can afford to triple the support to Ukraine. Actually, the government, I think, has now doubled the support to Ukraine for next year. That's really good. Okay, Norway's a small country, relatively speaking, but that's a meaningful amount of money still. And they're in a lucky position, but can the EU, can Europe as a whole, can South Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand, can we all come together and replace the US? I don't know. It remains to be seen. Is there enough political appetite given everyone's domestic issues they have and the rise of particularly the far right in Europe, but in some elements the far left as well? So Germany has a BSW, much smaller threat than AfD, but both the far right and far left in Germany are pretty much anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia. But most of the other places, it's a far right that seems to be wanting to put a spanner in the works. So lots of challenges in Europe. Now, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has emphasised the need to go further to change the trajectory, is the quote, on the war in Ukraine. Our support for Ukraine has kept them in the fight, but we need to go further to change the trajectory of the conflict. Fascinating. Again, this is good news. I'm starting to feel, I've been dooming and glooming. If Europe can really come together, if there's this unity, if we can put aside disinformation being vomited out from not actually just Russia. So I don't want to keep on going on about this person, but Elon Musk, for example, today or the last 24 hours has been driving divisions into the UK, talking about how there's this petition going around the UK feeding people who are anti-government, anti-establishment in the UK. He is the richest, most powerful man in the world, and he should stop fecking about in other people's businesses. You can say that about me. I keep making comments about what's going on in the US, but I'm not influencing change. I'm reporting things to you. I'm not the most powerful human being in the world that has injected myself into the middle of the American administration. So I think there's some incredibly irresponsible behavior going on that is helping the Russian narrative to spread around the world. This megaphone that Twitter is a megaphone for nefarious views and Russian propaganda, and it is being injected into the information spaces of every single country in the world. And I think it's deeply irresponsible. Right, NATO is discussing the possibility of preventative precision strikes on Russian territory if a conflict with the aggressor state breaks out. Now, NATO, lots of things on NATO here. It's going to be interesting to see whether, Matthew Whitaker, the new ambassador to NATO, or who is a Trump appointee, who is deeply, deeply unsuited to the role. He has absolutely no experience, but he's somewhat of a Trump man. If Trump is anti-NATO, does NATO cease to exist, or can the US pull out of NATO? Well, actually, the Senate, interestingly, I think it's Marco Rubio, who was predicting this some time back, put in or started the ball rolling for the legislation to disallow a president, i.e. an incoming Trump, to unilaterally withdraw the US from NATO. So I think it will be hard, but they can do things like stop funding activities and NATO activities and, just be a very difficult player in the mix. But then I wonder whether, the DOD will be okay for going along with this. There's one thing for Trump and a few kind of crazy MAGA people in the administration to make these claims about NATO, but actually that would be having to work against the received wisdom of the entirety of the Department of Defense. Yeah, you might find the odd Pete Hegseth around here who's willing to be a bit of a wingnut, but generally I don't think that will go down very well. And I wonder how much fight back there will be in the US DOD and whether they'll be fighting for Ukraine in the information space in the Trump administration, trying to convince Trump. Actually, it's a really good thing we do support Ukraine through X, Y, and Z because of A, B, and C. But the point I was trying to make is that you might see NATO start to become more of a European entity, or Canada. Then there's, of course, you've got the Indo-Pacific. But, I wonder whether NATO might take on a bit of an evolution over the next 2 years. I say 2 years because it's really interesting to see what happens in the midterm elections in the US. If my predictions, I wouldn't go on my predictions because I got the US election wrong. Okay, Euromite Press says Ukraine on the track to join the EU by 2030. So it's okay. NATO accession, EU accession by 2030, says EU Ambassador Martinova. She praised Ukraine's digital leadership and progress in reforms, but stressed the need for further judicial and anti-corruption efforts. My worry about everything in the world at the moment is that actually people are becoming too anti-establishment. Who would have thought I would have been one advocating for the status quo or for the normie centrism? I think at the moment every election this year being an anti-establishment election, and I think that's partly why Trump got voted in, is because people just think, yeah, screw the status quo, screw deep state, screw the government, screw, and we're in this period of history where everything's immediate, right? We have Wi-Fi that doesn't work. We're like, the rage. We have to have everything. We have to have it now. If I order something off the internet, I want it here tomorrow. And that is a frame of thought that I think pervades all of our lives, to the point where we look at that with regard to politics. And in the old days where we wouldn't know half the stuff that was going on politically, now we're so engaged, some of us are so engaged, and even those who aren't engaged, they are having things inserted on their feeds like, the government's done this, or this is happening there. And we hear about all the negative things, always the negative things about a ruling government. So you never like, oh, wow, the government's done this is awesome. So we're always being fed negative establishment, i.e. the ruling government, negativity about the ruling administration, to the point where it feeds just a constant disaffection. And that, I think, is the prelude to these consistent anti-establishment votes. And where am I leading you? Well, this is about the EU as well. So I think that we might see just 4-year election cycles in the US, not 8-year terms, now 4-year terms. So, all right, I'm bored of you, get out. Right, you haven't done it already? Right, I'm bored of you, get out. And every 4 years you're changing over. It's this constant churn because we're like more different now. Netflix, Amazon Prime, Paramount Plus, BBC iPlayer, more different. I want to see that. No, I'm bored of that. I want to see that. I want to see this. Oh. TikTok. And it's just change. Oh, slow down, guys. Slow down. let's think about what is good for stability, economic stability, political stability, security in the world. Is the EU, a normie centrist EU, actually what we need? A bit of stability. I am worried that anti-establishment thought is going to undermine the EU eventually. That's why you're seeing the rise of the AfD, the rise of this, the rise of that. Okay, we've got issues with immigration, and we've got issues with this, and we've got issues with that. Okay, rather than just go, we've got issues with that, tear the whole thing down, burn it down. Want to rip it down. You got Elon Musk coming in, and we want to get rid of $2 trillion worth of... Yeah, but that's more than the entire DoD budget. That's more than the cost of all of the people employed by the American government. Yeah, we're going to burn it down, burn it all down. Okay. Maybe we just go, how can we change that? Let's do things a little... Like, this is old school conservatism, actually, what I'm advocating here, which is slowly, rule of law, institutions, blah, blah, blah. And in a sense, I am advocating an old school conservatism rather than a real kind of knee-jerk progressivism or changeism. But I worry that the EU might be, torn down. I worry that all the institutions in the US are on the verge of getting torn down by some unelected oligarch billionaire with no mandate to do that. Right? It is inserting himself into the middle of the government to wreak all this havoc. And our own international security is on the chopping block here, and I think it's a real concern that the EU might be undermined by this very desire to always change, that nothing's ever good enough. It's all negative. Anyway, I digressed. She praised the Ukraine's digital leadership and progress in reforms, but stressed the need for further judicial and anti-corruption efforts. It's really good news that Ukraine is progressing in terms of jumping through the hoops for EU accession, and also NATO accession seems to be doable. Right, Emmanuel Macron, France's president, has said, or has an opportunity to finally take the lead and back his words with meaningful action, says Yoni Escola. Now that discussions about deploying European troops to Ukraine are back on the table, it should be a no-brainer now that Russia is using foreign troops in Ukraine. It might not happen though, matey. An article in Le Monde states that as the war in Ukraine escalates into a new phase, talks regarding the deployment of Western troops and private defense companies on Ukrainian territory have been revived. As Trump gears up to take the presidency again, the US may reduce its involvement in Europe if negotiations to resolve Russia's war in Ukraine falter. He could shift the responsibility of supporting Ukraine in Europe. Deploying troops to Ukraine doesn't mean that Western forces will engage in combat. European countries can send instructors and troops to secure areas away from the front line, freeing up Ukrainian units to move to more intense areas of the front. European troops could at least partially secure the borders with Belarus, Moldova, Hungary, Slovakia and Poland, and they would be able to train Ukrainians on the ground in Ukraine, which is much more efficient than training at a distance. By freeing up even a few Ukrainian brigades for the front and streamlining the training of mobilized troops, Europe would significantly bolster Ukraine's defense against Russia's unjust and unprovoked invasion. By maintaining a presence on the western bank of Dnipro, Europe would send a strong message to Moscow. It cannot escalate without facing consequences and will never be allowed to achieve its initial strategic objectives in Ukraine. Macron has spoken extensively, but his actions on Ukraine and European strategic autonomy have often been laughable so far. This is his chance to make a significant impact, leave a lasting legacy, and emerge as a prominent European leader in defence. Okay, so there is that. So that's broadly kind of Le Monde's position. We are seeing, these issues come to a head. How is NATO, how is the EU going to react to the escalation of the Russians, but also to the Trump presidency? Now, what's interesting in this respect, and this isn't really for the geopolitical video, I guess, but General Syrski has said today that Ukraine are getting ready for a counteroffensive, that we can't always be on defense. And that's a really interesting point, and I agree with him there, but that comes with controversies and caveats. But you might see the initiative try to be regained by Ukraine with some of those new units that are potentially being filtered through, having finished training and being equipped. Anyway, French aid to Ukraine goes on. Meaningful talks with Barrot on ways to strengthen Ukraine and ensure long-term security in Europe and counter threats posed by Russia. We appreciate France's defence assistance decisions to enable our use of long-range capabilities and the anticipated delivery of Mirage 2000, says Andrei Sybiha, the foreign minister for Ukraine, speaking to the foreign minister Barrot of France. Now, I forgot to mention this the other day. I think it's one of the ones I lost when I lost all my notes, but there is a rumour that the Mirage might be ready in a couple of weeks. If that's the case, happy days. But, pinch of salt and all that. Now, Italy has become Russia's main trading partner in the EU. In September 2024, the volume of trade between Russia and Italy reached 768 million euros. Germany remained the main exporter to Russia, with exports growing 3% to 647.8 million euros. Wow. Sale of used cars in Russia in October. Oh, no, that's not exports. That's just a general economic synopsis of what's going on. We're going to actually return to that in a second in the Russia segment. Okay, Czech intelligence chief has warned against a weak peace deal in Ukraine. So if Ukraine accepts a weak peace deal and terms with Russia, it poses a strategic threat to Central and Eastern Europe, says Michel Koudelka. Yes, of course, it is not in anyone's best interest that Ukraine is forced to a quick and hasty, but essentially unsatisfying deal with Russia. Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat says that the far right is weaponizing AI-generated content in Europe, with reference to The Guardian there. Experts say fake images raising fears around issues such as immigration have proliferated since the EU elections. We need to do something really serious. The EU needs to do it. The UK needs to do it about disinformation, about Twitter, and about the information spaces that Russia is able to manipulate. And yes, it will mean regulation. Yes, it will mean some form of sensible censorship. Because at the moment, damage is being done. And that damage turns into votes, that turns into lack of support for Ukraine, and turns into an emboldening and strengthening of Russia. So Russia ends up winning conflicts, information, cyber, conventional conflicts with us in Europe or the West as a whole. We need to be fighting in the information spaces. At the moment, we're too afraid because people go, oh, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. But if you do nothing, then you're like, oh, freedom of speech. And you just allow Russia to just invade your head and sit in your head and manipulate you from the inside. As I've said before, we wouldn't allow Russia to send their tanks into Europe. Well, we have. But into the EU, right? We wouldn't allow Russia to bomb with planes flying overhead in the UK to bomb our cities in the UK. But we seem to be fine with allowing them to invade our heads, our headspaces. Fine, welcome in, come and set up shop just by my frontal temporal lobe. Just set up shop there and just tell me what I need to think about everyone. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's what I think about Keir Starmer. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's what I think about this. Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Who? Oh, Ivan. Is it up in there? Oh, right. We need to be stronger in the information war and not be afraid to make bold decisions regarding disinformation. Polish farmers may block the entire Ukraine-Poland border in December. Roman Kondrov, leader of the Deceived Village, quote Deceived Village, stated that the current suspension of border checkpoint blockades, is temporary and protests could resume in December on a larger scale. These Polish farmers, and again, I wonder how much is as a result of the influence that coming from the Russians. Now, Shashant Joshi said he was at a conference yesterday, security conference, and there was a speech by Pat McFadden, who is, I think, UK defence chappie. And anyway, here's the speech as published. It's a lot of good in it. Unfortunately, it retains the line on Russia turning off the lights, something Russia has not been able to do via cyber means in Ukraine for the last 3 years of war, or in a decade since 2014. So he, let's just pop through a few things that he said. So, there is a lot in the speech to agree with. It helpfully frames Russian cyber ops as an effort to, quote, gain a strategic advantage to degrade the states that support Ukraine, and points out Russian targeting of UK media, telecoms, democracy, and energy infrastructure. So this is, we've gone from disinformation to like cyber attack, which also involves information warfare. Russian state-aligned groups have taken responsibility for at least 9 separate cyber attacks of varying severity against NATO states, including unprovoked attacks against our critical national infrastructure. So hospitals is a good example. In the US, it was in Pennsylvania, there's water treatment or water pipes. These are attacks by Russia, hybrid warfare. This is a form of warfare. And again, we are afraid to be bold in our response to this for fear of it being escalatory. In this case, it was North Korea who had attempted to use AI to accelerate its malware development and scan for cybersecurity gaps it could exploit. North Korea is the first, but it won't be the last. And this is a speech given at the NATO Cyber Defense Conference. Lots more. We could have a look at that speech, but I'm going to move on now. But there are all consistently these concerns with cybersecurity, of course, and lots of conferences taking place. And there's been a lot of NATO and security conferences. A security conference in Halifax. People are saying the right things. People are in these sources, these bases, these fonts of knowledge, seem to have the right idea about who Russia are, or who Russia is, who the Russians are, who the Kremlin is, and what Putin is, who he is, what he's like, and the fact that he's a malign dictator. Okay, why is this information not getting out to the general public effectively enough, and proliferating to, in the case of the US, half the country and half the political landscape, or maybe a portion, an important portion, the decision-making portion of half the political landscape? That's frustrating. Is that, yeah, this all makes sense. Yeah, cybersecurity issues. Yeah, the Russia are doing this. Yeah, okay. There are these issues. Yeah, we know that Russia's getting involved in information projects and spreading disinformation right throughout this country and that country, Europe and the US. Okay. Well, then why are we not seeing the incoming administration talking about this nearly enough? Why is it? Is because they helped that administration to get in. That's a problem. There's this kind of tension that exists, that if you start calling it out, then you have to admit that actually they've been helping you as one side get into power. JD Vance was questioned on this, and he was unable to give an answer. He was unable to talk about what he would do about the disinformation proliferating in the US as a result of Russian interference, because he knows that he has benefited as a result of it. So Christopher Miller here from the Financial Times saying that Russia has expelled another British diplomat after the FSB accused a Moscow embassy employee of providing false information when applying for diplomatic accreditation, claiming it had seen signs of intelligence and subversive work. My thoughts is that things are going to get worse diplomatically between, say, the UK and Russia, but pick any country: Germany, Russia, France, Russia, the US, Russia, arguably. I wonder whether there'll just be diplomats expelled, and then the EU expels a load of Russian diplomats, and we get to a real critical stage where things are looking very hairy. And I just hope that there are enough people inside the Russian administration, inside the Kremlin, who realise that Putin has taken Russia on this journey towards, unfortunately for them, towards the precipice, towards the edge of the cliff. And there are enough people that want what's best for Russia, and Putin is moved aside. But I don't know. That is just pure hopium, quite possibly. Right, Russia has imposed sanctions against 30 British citizens, and not only getting rid of that diplomat, including the British Ministers of the Interior, Finance, Health and Justice, as well as journalists from the Times and the Daily Mail. it's good news in my book, because if Russia pick on the Daily Mail and the Times, then those are right-wing news sources in the UK. And the UK, we're in a pretty good position because even the Daily Mail is consistently writing articles against Russia. We don't have that split. We have got a bipartisan support for Ukraine in the UK, generally speaking, and we've got a pretty good bipartisan support for Ukraine across the media divide as well. And I don't think we see that in the US so much, and that is a real challenge, and in other countries. So when I see often Daily Telegraph, Times, Daily Mail articles really critical of Russia, that makes me happy. EU propose, and if Russia are going to harass these news agencies, these media organizations, then actually that works in Ukraine's favor, I think. EU proposes sanctions on Chinese firms aiding Russia's drone production. The proposed 15th sanctions package, it sounds like it's going to be a big one, targets over 50 individuals and 30 entities, focusing on Chinese companies allegedly aiding Russia in the Ukraine war. Bloomberg writes that Turkey is negotiating with the US to lift some sanctions against Russia. Oh my goodness. Turkey's goal is to continue paying Gazprom Bank, that's just been sanctioned, for Russian natural gas imports. Russia is Turkey's largest gas supplier, accounting for about 42% of its imports last year. Wow. Yeah. And speaking of hydrocarbons, Kazakhstan aims to boost oil exports through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, targeting 1.5 million tonnes in 2024, with plans to reach 20 million tonnes annually in the future. This move would reduce the more than 80% share of flows it currently sends via Russia. In other words, 80% of its transportation of oil go through Russia. Kazakhstan could be, and Russia will be getting a cut in that. If Kazakhstan are going to redirect that through other pipelines, then that is very good news for seeing Russia economically impacted going forward. It's things like that have an effect, and that Russia is already in a perilous situation. So just coming out now, as Jay in Kiev says, holy crapola, the Russian ruble is being totally destroyed. It is now, I mean, this may change, but this particular snapshot was 107.9485. It's almost 108. It has shot up today alone, as you can see there. Now, this means that inflation is going to be affected. This is export. The cost of exports will be affected, and it's a spiral that Russia seems to be picking up speed in being swept up in. Now, Russian media report says, Anton Gerashenko, quote, Russia and Iran have completely abandoned the dollar in mutual settlements. The countries conduct transactions only in their national currencies, the Iranian central bank said. In addition, Iran has created and started using an analogue of SWIFT, the Akuma banking system. With its help, the country carries out settlements with the member states of the Asian Clearing Union. Has Russia managed to connect to this analogue of SWIFT, or was it refused? Well, really interesting here that, I mean, if Iran takes the Russian ruble and Russia only takes the Iranian, I don't know what the currency is in Iran, but if they only pay each other in those currencies, those are not currencies you can easily use elsewhere. Like, not many countries are going to be accepting the Iran paying in Iranian currency, and the ruble is a bit like poison. So this only helps each other here, but certainly worth knowing. Now, Russia is using gold and informal trade networks with China's help, apparently, to sidestep Western sanctions, according to Francesca Chiaretti, John Kennedy and Maxine Summerfield-Antoniou of RAND in their op-ed. So we have heard that they've even been doing bartering with, I think, India, or was it Pakistan, over certain things, tangerines and all. We've just seen about Iran. We're now looking at China assisting Ukraine in trade using alternative trade routes. But I'm pretty sure that all of these are suboptimal for Russia, and they will be paying over the odds. Now, Russia's high interest rates make export contracts unprofitable, according to the Rostec head. So this is the head of the military defense concern, Rostec. So one of the many Russian industrial companies and lobby groups to complain of prohibitively high interest rates in recent months. The central bank's key rate, currently at 21%, may be raised further in an effort to curb persistent inflation. With such a key rate, Chemezov says, of course, it's just madness. Any export contract becomes unprofitable for us. So that's the Russian military export industry hit. The ruble tanking. I mean, everything is pretty challenging in the Russian economy right now. Now, interesting. So moving off the economy, we have Putin apparently saying to the former EU Commission chief Jose Manuel Barroso that the claim is Putin told me he did not want Ukraine to exist, which is genocidal thinking. That is exactly what we would expect given what we think we know about the dictator Vladimir Putin. You know, so many people are like, NATO expansionism, oh, NATO encroaching, oh, it's a US. No, Putin doesn't want Ukraine to exist. There you go. He said it. Of course, you can question whether he did really say that to Barroso, but I have no reason to disbelieve it. Russian lawmakers submit a bill on Taliban's removal from a terrorist list. My goodness, Russia are really hanging out with some nice people. A group of Russian lawmakers submitted a bill that would allow the Taliban Islamist movement to be removed from Russia's list of terrorist organisation, according to State Duma's website yesterday. Well done, Russia. And meanwhile in Russia, state TV host Vladimir Solovyov and head of RT Margarita Simonyan gushed about Oreshnik, so that's his intercontinental ballistic missile or intermediate range ballistic missile that was used the other day, and Trump's cabinet picks, predicting the US will eventually back down. Henry Sadaryan explained that all Russians have imperial ambitions. So put that together with the idea that Putin says that he did not want Ukraine to exist, and you've got propagandists saying everyone in Russia has imperial ambitions, then I think you get a pretty good picture of what has been going on. Right, moving on to American politics concerning the war in Ukraine. So the US Secretary of State Campbell has said that China is increasingly unnerved by the Russia-North Korea cooperation. China has remained officially neutral and has emphasized that Russia-North Korean cooperation is a sovereign choice, but greater US support for Japan and South Korea, which will be directed to this cooperation, could cause China to pivot against it. Former CIA Assistant Director for the Indo-Pacific, Dennis Wilder, saw Chinese media silent on the Russia-North Korean Mutual Defense Pact and the entry of North Korean troops to Ukraine as striking. So the fact that they weren't supportive of it, didn't really say anything, is interesting in and of itself. Nuclear assistance to North Korea would presumably be China's red line. They're very serious about nuclear, the Chinese. Now, Sebastian Gorka, who is someone I do not like one iota. There's not one molecule of that man's body that I appreciate. Shashank Joshi here says, the, quote, flood Ukraine with aid threat only makes sense if Russia believes Trump will go to Congress and seek a large supplemental of the sort that he, Vance and others fought viciously earlier this year against. And this approach doesn't settle the issue of what sort of deal he demands. So there are loads of caveats applied to this rhetoric. And it might just be rhetoric, but it's a kind of good rhetoric to hear from Sebastian Gorka, who... Anyway, let's listen to him. So he is going to be a minor. He doesn't have to be vetted by the Senate because he's taking on a more minor position in the upcoming administration. He's going to be head of counterterrorism, I believe.
I'll give one tip away that the president has mentioned. He will say to that murderous former KGB colonel, that thug who...
So we've got murderous former KGB colonel, that thug, belittling Putin and calling him a murderous thug is strong rhetoric that we haven't heard from Trump or Vance. I've said this so many times, and that we're hearing it from Gorka, who is someone I would least expect to hear this from, is quite fascinating to me.
Runs the Russian Federation. You will negotiate now, or the aid that we have given to Ukraine thus far will look like peanuts that's how he will force those gentlemen to come to an arrangement that stops the bloodshed.
Now, although that sounds good, actually what underwrites that is a forced negotiation. So this is basically the Kellogg Flight's peace plan, which is if Russia doesn't come to the negotiating table, Ukraine gets all the aid they want. You know, you make it look like peanuts. And if Ukraine don't come to the negotiating table, then Ukraine will not get any more aid. The problem is, that sounds great. So the rhetoric from Gorka is good in his approach to Russia as who Russia are. But the very nature of forcing a negotiation is to benefit Russia. So if you force a negotiation over it's going to take me one day and it's going to happen before I get inaugurated. Well, that's clearly a lie because it hasn't happened yet. And it's been many, many days since November the 5th. So it's not going to be one day unless you're changing it now. And it's going to be one day after you are inaugurated, in which case I doubt that's going to happen. So it's just a lie. Why do we ever believe Trump is full of rubbish? But the whole nature of that forced negotiation is to the benefit of Russia. 100% to the benefit of Russia. Trump officials to receive immediate clearances and easier FBI vetting. This is worst case. Like, this is just, it's not looking good. So all these people who are, I think, incredibly dubious nominees are going to supposedly have an easier ride to be selected formally because Trump's transition team is planning for all cabinet picks to receive sweeping security clearances from the president-elect and only face FBI background checks after the incoming administration takes over the bureau and its own officials are installed in key positions. This is just putting their own people in these positions of power and utilizing the FBI, the CIA to be overtly politicized. There's going to be retribution. I think it's going to be an ugly couple of years. It's going to be an ugly year, 6 months. So, watch out for that. And that's worrying because people like, particularly Pete Hegseth and definitely particularly Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., these people need to be vetted really, really seriously because who paid for Tulsi Gabbard to go to Bashar al-Assad in Syria a couple of years back? Who paid for that? No one knows yet. What's going on there and why did she come away singing the praises of Syria and Russia? What is going on there and why is she being put in charge of the national intelligence? So lots of questions needing to be answered, preferably by the FBI there, but if they are unable to do those background checks, then this is not good. Now, we had the Joe Rogan issue the other day. Here's a really fascinating video, Ukrainian Freedom News here.
It's most complicated.
This is Joe Rogan. The foundation to this is Rogan's expressing of Russian narrative and Russian propaganda that was then called out by Vladimir Klitschko, the former heavyweight boxing champion, and we'll see in a second, Dmytro Kuleba, the former foreign minister for Ukraine. Hey, Joe Rogan, you like inspiring stories of people doing the most excellent things. Would you ever consider listening to a few voices of Ukrainians who continue to excel even as Russia hits the hell out of them with North Korean missiles and Iranian drones? Why not talk to Klitschko or Stako Tennis, so Sergei Stakovsky, a proud Ukrainian serving in the Ukrainian armed forces, who now fights in the trenches but who once defeated Roger Federer at Wimbledon? Or how about the warrior Gandalf? So another one, Azov Brigade officer, National Guard of Ukraine, tactical wizard, active military since 2016. So someone else that might work. In Ukraine, you might find your best allies for freedom against deep state corruption. Anyway, here is an interesting video that shows Joe Rogan's proclivity for rather dubious spokespeople on certain topics.
It's most complicated. Live for your country. That means fight for life.
Joe Rogan believes in ice baths as a way to shock the system awake each morning. But, Joe, have you ever tried a missile bath? Rogan has one of the most interesting shows in the world.
When you don't have freedom.
With brilliant thinkers talking about freedom. And yet the Joe Rogan Experience mischaracterizes one place in the world where everyday free people do extraordinary things.
The U.S. is engaging in a proxy war.
So often, Rogan has guests talking about Ukraine who have never been to Ukraine. Why not instead hear from people like Volodymyr Klitschko, a Ukrainian former heavyweight champion of the world? The brother of Kyiv mayor Vitaly, Volodymyr's career as a sportsman surely would appeal to Rogan's audience, especially his new career and life, helping his countrymen in an existential war. What does one learn from war about human achievement? What's it like to go from the elite world of a top athlete to suddenly facing missiles and drones in your hometown?
You know what, I'm gonna run to my death, so to speak, just to end up this misery. But no, the strength is of us Ukrainians that also we don't want to die.
Open your eyes, invite some guests from Ukraine.
And I think that's, it needs to be done. He needs to be called out, and he needs to accept some of these guests. As mounting pressure, Dmytro Kuleba says, "Hi, Joe Rogan. Freaking out Ukrainians without giving them a chance to speak isn't a fair fight. If you ever feel like having a real conversation, let's sit down and have a chat about anything Ukraine related, dragons included," because he's talking about pulling the tail of the dragon. You know your stuff. I know mine. Cigars are on me. And that's how to do it. And I really do hope something comes of these challenges, because I think this is how you get information out into the information. When you hear today that 51% of Americans are against providing military aid to Ukraine, then the information space has changed. And people like Joe Rogan have a great responsibility to impart knowledgeably on a whole plethora of topics, including Ukraine. And if he's spreading Russian propaganda, then something needs to change that. Okay, now Edward Hunter Chrissy here referring to New York Times, quoting the Times. Trump is keeping secret the names of the donors who are funding his transition effort, a break from tradition that could make it impossible to see what interest groups, businesses, or wealthy people are helping launch his second term. Foreign nationals are allowed to donate to the transition. Trump is the first president-elect to sidestep the restrictions, provoking alarm among ethics experts. Those seeking to curry favour may donate directly without their names or potential conflicts ever entering the public sphere. And unlike with campaign contributions, foreign nationals are allowed to donate to the transition. Right, you may be the biggest Trump fan in the world, but like if this was happening the other way around, you would be going absolutely freaking nuts. If the Democrats said, "Oh, do you know what? We're not," so at the moment, the Trump transition haven't signed an ethics declaration, so they're not beholden to ethical guidelines. Why would you do that unless you want to be unethical? Like, honestly. So you know they're going to be unethical. So now they are bending the rules so that they don't, or bending the norms so they don't have to announce where they're getting money from. Now, I can't, as a British citizen, I cannot donate to a political campaign in the US. So if I wanted to donate to the Harris Walls campaign, I couldn't have done it. But I can donate to the Trump transition. And so they are receiving money, which is, why would you give money to a transition unless you wanted something back? Like, why would you, like, you're in, right? My guy's in, cool, happy days, right? I'm happy with that. I'm going to give you loads more money. Why would I give, especially as a foreign donor, why would a foreign donor give to the Trump transition unless it wanted something back? So we could have this situation where Russia and China and any other entity or people from those nations, Saudi Arabia, are able to give large amounts of money to the Trump transition and no one will ever know. I honestly, like the levels of corruption that if they aren't taking place, then the permission is there for it to take place. We don't know it's not taking place because no one seems to be worried about adhering to ethical norms. Honestly, if this was the other side and you are a Trump supporter or a Republican, you would be going, and rightfully going, nuts. I wouldn't advocate for this from if the Democrats are doing that, and I'm more of a fan of the Democrats than the Republicans. I wouldn't advocate for that because there's no justification. There's literally no sense in that unless you want to get away with unethical behaviour. Money is swapping hands and it's unethical. Now, If you want to take that step further, Trump transition team suggests sidelining a top advisor over pay-to-play allegations. So we have a chap, Boris Epstein, has been charging people money to advocate for them to get into roles. Pay-to-play. So a monthly, I think, amount of money as well. You pay me however many thousands of dollars monthly, and I'll make sure you get into this role in the Trump administration. Now, this is obviously highly controversial, but now some of the GOP are turning on him, and it's not. I mean, goodness me, this administration. Or if you think this is what you voted for, this is what you wanted, then you've got a different idea of political ideal than I do. Like, if you voted for corruption, then well done, you've got it. Where's the rule of law? Where are ethics here? It's obscene what's happening. Okay, now let's have a look at this. So the US economy, and this is going to be really important because, oops, I didn't want to do that. That's actually a link. This is really interesting because there are going to be some decisions made, if we are to believe the Trump administration, that could be insanely bad for the US, and the US could go into a chaotic period where I think Ukraine might play a very distant second fiddle, as all sorts of chaos is going on inside the US, and this is exactly what Russia would want, by the way. So at the moment, the US productivity growth is amazing. The bedrock of long-run prosperity is booming, massively outshining peer nations. It's a fruit of running the labour market hot post-COVID, and now it's delivering higher wages, consumption and welfare. What's really frustrating is full well that Trump is going to take credit for this. But this is what the Biden administration has successfully done. All the metrics for a successful economy are being hit by the Biden economy. Bidenomics worked. You may not like to hear that, but they worked. The Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Chips and Sciences Act, they have brought in manufacturing growth, wage growth. They've brought inflation down below 2% to a manageable level. You have got all sorts of investments going on. This is looking very good, right? The US against peer nations is way out in front. Look at all these other nations, but because people said, inflation was bad a couple of years ago, I still feel it. I still feel it's bad now. Things are expensive. You're like, yeah. Imagine being in another country where you're being properly screwed over. The fact that they aren't even more expensive is because the economy has been kept in check by a decent administration. So here's my point. That if I could have taken you through this very long thread here about the productivity and the success of the American economy. You can go and look at it yourself. Joey Politano does a really good in-depth dive into the productivity, US labor productivity, etc., etc. But the point is that don't fix what ain't broke. If you received, if I was an incoming administration and I looked at the economy, I was like, holy crap. I didn't want to admit it during the campaign. I didn't want to say anything. But I tell you what, the economy's really good. What should we do, guys? The first thing I would say to my team would be, don't freaking do anything. We just let this go. We tinker a little bit really superficially, and we claim that we were responsible for this awesome economy. And we take all the plaudits for what the previous administration did. It's what happened in 2016 after 8 years of Obama. That's what Obama claimed on the campaign, that Trump's successful 2016 to 2020 economy, even though actually it started going bad, was, and that's before COVID, was on the back of the work of the Obama administration. That's his claim. I wouldn't change anything. So what are we just about to see? Well, this is the announcement. So Trump says he will implement a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, all products coming into the United States, on his first day taking office. And he's also talked about a 10% tariff on all Chinese goods. But what you're going to see, this is really important to the Ukraine war, because if he does this, you are going to see the US get involved in a trade war with China, with both its neighbours, and potentially the EU as well. So we are at the moment at this point where we're all trying to look after money. We all want to get more money for our national and international defence, and we want to get more money for investment in Ukrainian defence industry and for the provision of aid to Ukraine. This is what's really important because the global chess game is looking very dodgy at the moment. If you are going to throw into those pressures a trade war with the US, with everyone involved, then we could see a freaking crazy next 6 months. If he's going to do that on day one, it's insane. Like, I just don't... Like, you've got an amazing economy. It's going really well. All the indicators are good. Don't do anything. Now, I know other people, Brian Ivey was saying you've got to realise that this is a bargaining chip for the war against fentanyl and immigration. But those are two different things. Yes, okay, this is a tool you could use, but bear in mind two things. One, this is a tool that other people are saying, oh, he's using this as an attack on fentanyl, and as he says here. But I think he's always wanted to put tariffs on, and it wasn't to do with fentanyl, and it wasn't to do with immigration. He said tariffs is the most beautiful word. He just wants to tariff everyone. It's his power. It's his like transactional nature. But it's economically insane to do across-the-board tariffs. Like strategic tariffs on certain goods and certain domains, yes, sensible, can be really useful. I'm not totally anti-tariffs. Across-the-board tariffs, which is what he's saying, all products, all caps, on all products coming into the United States, then you've got a problem here, because the tool you're using to try and get fentanyl and immigration under control is a tool that you're hitting your own consumers with. I'm going to teach you something. You are going to send fentanyl into my country? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make all my people pay more stuff. All of you guys, you're going to pay more for everything. That'll teach you, won't it? Yeah, and you. I know you can't afford anything. Tough luck. Everything's going to be more expensive. Oh, no, I'm punishing my own people. Oh, dear. So the tool he's using to attack these other nations to get things under control will prima facie hurt his own consumers, his own electorate. Now, it might end up having a desired effect, but my goodness, it's going to be an inflationary effect as well. So you might get fentanyl under control somehow by putting tariffs on these nations. But it's a dangerous game, really dangerous game. So Catherine Rampel here talks about this. So in case you forget, Donald Trump, you're the one that signed the USMCA, which is the free trade agreement between Mexico. You know, try to get rid of NAFTA to bring in this thing so that you can have free trade across the borders to try and get this free trade situation, anti-tariff situation, if you like. And now he's having a go at that and saying, oh, that sucks. You're the one that signed it, mate. He's like, no, I want tariffs. Anyway, here's a breakdown of the goods that the US imports from Mexico alone. Just an awful lot of stuff. So you've got crude and petroleum. That's going to affect things. Cars, delivery trucks, motor vehicles, computers, broadcasting equipment, wire, gold, silver, fruits, vegetables, beer, medical instruments, all of this stuff. Straight away, you're going to get like 25% tariffs on them. If you voted out the incumbent because you thought grocery prices were too high, I've got some bad news for you. For example, 90% of our avocados come from Mexico. Guacamole is really going to cost extra. If you voted for the incumbent because you thought housing prices were too high, we've got more bad news for you. We import $105 billion worth in cement, lime and minerals and $28 billion in lumber and paper from Canada. We also already tariff that lumber to death. Expect construction costs to go through the roof, so to speak. If you voted out the incumbent because you thought gas prices were too high, yet more bad news for you. The petroleum industry is well integrated across North America. In the American Midwest, most refined petroleum products come from Canada. I asked some expert for the back of the envelope estimate for how much these tariffs would affect gas prices. His response: "Hi Catherine, the back of the envelope calculation tonight would be a 25% tariff on Canadian crude would impact the regions I mentioned, the Rockies, Great Lakes and the Midwest, the most, as those markets are where the Canadian crude is vital to the refining process, and refineries have been set up to run heavier Canadian crude for many decades. It could boost oil prices right now approximately 35 cents a gallon, but it could do more damage in warmer months when cleaner gasoline is required. I previously estimated the range is potentially 25 to 75 cents a gallon, and that'd be what I'd stick to in terms of potential impact on gas prices." Patrick Dehaan adds, I'd guesstimate the impact would be billions of dollars to US motorists on a yearly basis, perhaps $6 to $10 billion per year. If you voted out the incumbent because you thought he'd help the US auto industry, I have even more bad news for you as trade expert. Someone else, Klausing, observes auto parts cross North American borders many times in the process of making a car or truck. So you make a car, it comes across the border to make this component, that then goes back across the border to make that component, then comes back across here to do that. And each time that's getting a 25% tariff, then the eventual thing that you're manufacturing, whether it be in Mexico or the US, will be inflated in price. And then if that's being re-imported back from Mexico into the US, or you're building it in the US, you've got a more expensive piece of stuff. This will wreak havoc on the US auto sector. Not to mention that we import a ton of other inputs and intermediate goods from Canada and Mexico, machinery, metals, wood, that get used by US manufacturers to make higher value products. So the downstream US firms that depend on those firms will be screwed too. And we haven't even gotten to the likely retaliatory tariffs. Fun fact, the average American eats about 20 pounds of fresh tomatoes per year, 2/3 of which now come from Mexico. And so if you start getting retaliation, then tariffs go on American goods, so America can't then sell as much to Mexico, as Mexico will be protecting their own industry, so you won't be exporting as much. This is a recipe for disaster. Now, some people are saying Trump is heading for a real horror show and the GOP will be held accountable. So Senator Blumenthal, who's a Democrat, says he's pointed to Trump's decision to not only enact tariffs, but also appoint Twitter ex-CEO Elon Musk to what he describes as a hit squad that could target Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid for cuts in order to fund more tax cuts for the wealthy. It's very hard to make those kinds of promises and fulfill them, he said. Republicans will be held accountable, not only the president-elect when he takes office, but also many Republican colleagues in the United States Senate if they go along with these irresponsible policies. So you could start getting, this is against like free market republicanism really, so there could be some absolute chaos. And then you throw into this the oligarchy of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy being unelected and without a mandate from the electorate, being placed in the center and saying they're going to make $2 trillion worth of cuts to the American government, which is more than the entire wage bill of every single public sector worker in the United States. That's more than the Department of Defense budget. What the hell? What are they going to cut? What swinging cuts are they going to make? Then you're thinking, some people are claiming NASA's going to go. And then you've had an argument between Ramaswamy and Trump and Musk already because of, I forget what it was to do with. It might have been, that was it. Ramaswamy wants to cut subsidies to Musk, SpaceX. So Musk gets like billions of dollars worth of subsidies, or has over the life of his contracts. I think $4 billion worth of US subsidies, 4.09 billion. And Vivek Ramaswamy is saying, well, we're going to cut out those subsidies that are going to, SpaceX. And Musk gone, no, you're not. It's just corruption is going to go on here. Anyway, nothing to see here, says Mehdi Hassan. Just the world's richest man, technically still just a private citizen, threatening to arrest democratically elected officials. This is what an oligarchy looks like. He's responding to Elon Musk, who on Twitter 2 days ago said those who break the law will be arrested, and that includes mayors. Who was he talking about? Like, what's he doing going around threatening people with the use of American judicial system, of the law, the American law, in a way that as if he's the president? So anyway, Elon Musk is apparently already targeting government workers by name as he recommends mass firings. We've heard that Vivek Ramaswamy wants to fire people whose social security numbers end in an even number. You've got Musk already naming and shaming people that he's going to fire. This is just a recipe for a disaster. And at which time we're trying to deal with climate crisis, we're trying to deal with the war in Ukraine, we're trying to deal with the threat of Russia, we're trying to deal with the threat of China. America's dealing with all this, and it appears that Trump is going to take a wrecking ball to the entire American government. Now, some anti-establishment, this is where we go back full circle. Some people will be like, yeah, screw the government, yeah. By the way, you know all your cousins work in that department? These are just working class people that are turning up to work and doing their job. You know they're going to lose their jobs over that. You know, then what's going to happen? So your tax money is now going to be spent on what unemployment benefit for like the $2 trillion worth of cuts are going to be made, and all those people are going to lose their job. Half the people, you know, anyone with a social security number ends in an even number. That's half of the workers who lose their job in the government. What's going to happen to the government? What about your Medicare? So it's just what I'm worried that the reason I'm spending this much time on American politics and issues with the government is that you could, if all of this actually happens, is it all speak? Well, I don't know. You've got Musk and Ramaswamy seem to be happily getting on with it. They've employed freaking Marjorie Taylor Wingnut Green to help out. Honestly, it's going to be the most divisive tenure in American political history, and you could have an absolute clown show. And who's going to be laughing? Who around the world is going to be laughing? Yup, Putin. Yup, Xi Jinping. Honestly, it's not looking good for the US at the moment. So here, this has come from New York Times. Quote, they want to carve what Mr. Musk says will be at least $2 trillion from the annual federal budget, a figure that exceeds the annual cost for salaries for every federal employee. For the record, the total federal budget in the 2024 fiscal year was $6.75 trillion. So they want to cut by over a quarter, almost a third, the entire federal budget. These two billionaires. I'll tell you what. You could give the federal budget that much money from your own pocket and they'll carry on working and everyone will be happy. Thank you very much. Absolute insanity. Even eliminating the entire defense budget of the United States would not get Musk halfway to the goal. Right, and this is where I'm going to draw a parallel. You might say, oh, really? Keep on going on about Trump and American politics. Yeah, it is that important. But also, let's draw a parallel between Putin and Trump here. Really interesting one. And I think you need to know this. So you've heard me talk previously, I'll take that down just for time, but you've heard me talk previously about how I think Putin lives in an information bubble because he doesn't have a smartphone. He doesn't think the internet is reliable. He thinks it's a tool of the CIA. So he receives all his information by people around him giving him manila folders with different coloured manila folders with different information in. He lives in a really constrained information bubble that is defined to him by those around him. He, I would imagine, has very little control over what he knows because there's no way of checking that himself independently. If you refuse to go on the internet, how are you going to check anything? You have to go back to the very people that delivered you that information or find other people, but they're going to be, how do you know that they're not all part of this kind of FSB set up out here that are just manipulating you? So there's an argument to say that Putin is some kind of puppet of the FSB or puppet of the people around him who feed him the information they want him to know. Right, let's go now to a very fascinating piece here. So Mehdi Hassan says 33-year-old former far-right cable anchor Natalie Harp may be the most important person in America that you've never heard of. She controls all of the online information flow to Donald Trump. Literally. So here we've got an excerpt from a news piece. But Miss Harp also established herself as the centre of the fast-moving carousel of text messages, articles and tidbits directed at Mr. Trump. This has generated concern among other aides who feel she has been far too willing to serve as a funnel for conspiratorial information at a moment when Mr. Trump appears more contemptuous than ever of attempts to manage or control him. One of her go-to news sources, people who have observed her say, is the website Gateway Pundit, which frequently disseminates conspiracy theories embraced by the far right. So you've got one of the most important men on earth after Elon Musk is Donald Trump. And if he's being fed conspiracy theory articles and a diet of really unhealthy information, I use the term information with scare quotes, then you've got Ms. Harp, who Trump's knowledge is contingent upon Ms. Harp. She is dictating to him, arguably, what he knows and his understanding of the world. And if that is coming through with a very peculiar, particular lens, then this is a problem. Garbage in, garbage out. You can't make good decisions if you are being fed poor information. Ms. Harp might indeed be one of the most important people in the world that you've never heard of. And we have an interesting parallel to Putin there. Although we don't know the names of the people that provide information, although Trump has his ability to go online and etc., he's probably spending too much time dictating tweets to people. He doesn't read that much. So this information, I can imagine this plays entirely into how Trump sees the world. He's getting these particular articles or excerpts from articles curated by someone else, sent to him to feed his own sense of what the world is, in this spiral that he will go down, so that he ends up in some conspiratorial rabbit hole. It's just, very, very challenging. Anyway, that's enough from me. That's a lot to be thinking about today, and I know it is not all precisely to do with the war in Ukraine. This American section hopefully is enough to make you think, okay, there's enough to worry about there. But as ever, question everything, particularly what I say, or not particularly just as much what I say as everything else you hear. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.